So ants are pretty small. We know this. We often step on them, usually by mistake, not out of malice, in a similar way to how it's been characterized that Cthulhu might step on humans. Again, not out of malice, just out of pure ignorance. We're so small and insignificant to him that he may not even see us or think of us as being important, negligible. Now, that said, upon a quick Google search, you can find two things. Namely, first, that ants make up a very sizable portion of all biomatter on this planet, all terrestrial life, and that's about 15 to 20% is kind of the estimate. So that's a lot of life. And the other thing being that they've been around for a very, very long time before humans. They reckon that they at least date back to the Cretaceous period and at most potentially even the Jurassic. And both of these periods are known for one main thing. We associate them with dinosaurs, which means that ants have essentially been around since dinosaurs have existed. But unlike the dinosaurs, the ants actually survived those periods. Whether they maybe hid under a rock when the meteor struck, though I doubt that would actually save your life from a meteor. Regardless, they're still alive, and yet we still associate these big things, the dinosaurs, with that time and place. Now, if the dinosaurs were so important, or we see them as so important in that time, and yet the ants still exist, what does that say about us? Ants are still here now, millions of years later in the Holocene epoch, or, the epoch defined by mankind. Hi, I'm Gabe. Welcome to my account. Basically when I say what we're focusing on and what we're here for today, by which I mean the reason I'm talking to myself and you're hopefully engaging with me, is essentially I want to talk about some of the questions that are on my mind, usually subjects surrounding philosophy, religion. We also guarantee very poor audio quality, as evidenced by this little peg and microphone and me sitting in my car. So, if you like bad audio quality, please stick around, and don't forget to follow my account for more. Anyway, so our topic for today is essentially around ants and whether they can provide a kind of gateway or lens by which we can understand consciousness. Why do I say this? Right? It's a pretty big claim. Now, from what I was talking to my mate about, bear in mind that these are not things that I've sort of, this is not information that I've necessarily sourced or done a ton of research on, so I'm lying to you for all intents and purposes, so please do go and look into this yourself if you're interested. But what we were talking about is essentially that ants invented at least three things before humans. Firstly, they invented farming. Secondly, war. And thirdly, slavery, the greatest of all inventions, right? That's sarcasm, just to be clear. Thank you, algorithm. Now, okay, ants discovered all these things before us. What do I mean by that? So when I say ants discovered farming, I mean that ants, acting off of apparently unconscious drives and biological instincts, have learnt to take back leaves from certain places and bring them back to their nest, their colony, and in there they let them kind of sit in the perfect moist and dark conditions, and then they grow certain types of fungus, and they might extract some kind of medicinal usage from the properties of this fungus or plant. So they essentially have invented farming and also medicine. With war, well, there are ant colonies, and they literally fight each other over resources and land. Sound familiar? That's right, and they've been doing that for longer than us, amazingly. And then thirdly, slavery. Essentially, they raid different nests, and they capture the offspring and larvae, and they raise them as slaves to make their lives easier. All these things seem to occur, from a human perspective, they seem to occur by a process which is reasonable. And that's not to say that war or slavery is good behavior. No, stop it, don't do that. But the thing is, it does come about for reasons, whether good or bad. You might say usually for things like war and slavery, the reason is to, make life easier, it's to obtain resources, and it's to fulfill our needs, our biological needs. And so anything that achieves those needs, we tend to deem reasonable. Now, ants are essentially doing the same thing as us, and yet we don't look at them the same way. So that's to say, as humans, we are very familiar with consciousness. I'm sure that you've had plenty of conversations with yourself, your internal monologue, not that everyone has one, but we have some kind of way of internalizing our experience and associating with that and calling that the self, and that is something that exists in us, whether that's a construct or not. And that's heavily debated within philosophy of mind, which is to say, the way we try and understand mind and its relation to matter often talks about this kind of topic. We have these two big sort of schools of thought within philosophy in relation to how we make actions, and that's often free will and determinism. Free will, firstly, being, that we can act independent of the things surrounding us, like our, nature and nurture, you could say, psychology. Like, we have the ability to act independently of that and come up with ideas and solutions and plans and actions and act accordingly. And then determinism says that essentially, the reason I decided to clean my room is because my mother instilled in me the value of cleanliness, which was in turn passed on to her by our culture, which values cleanliness. And that evolved sort of mimetically, you could say, for various reasons, and most of them are, useful reasons. So, we look at the outcomes of our actions, and we see that the outcome is beneficial or useful. And unlike ants, or so we think, we have this accompanying self-awareness or consciousness there, and that sort of is happening alongside the building of societies and the slavery and war, farming, all of this, and yet we see, even though ants may not have that, it also developed society, and they also have different classes, unlike a lot of animals, which is interesting because they actually have like different ants that will be created as like worker ants and fighter ants. I'm not too familiar with all the classes, but essentially, unlike us and unlike possums who might have the random genetic mutation thrown in here and there willy-nilly, they actually have, specific classes for specific purposes. And we only have that by what we think is our reason or our consciousness. We've come to a point where we've decided that's good and useful. So if the ants have that, and they possibly had that long before humans invented that, and possibly even long before the first man walked on two legs. So they've been doing it a long time. What's the difference? Why are we special when they can actually get to a similar point socially and economically as us? Having society, having war, farming, all of this, agriculture. Well, that's kind of the question of today's video. So that's a big thing to think about. But basically, here's my thoughts in terms of what that could mean about consciousness. So either because of the similar point that ants and humans have gotten to, then either sort of one of two things, the way I see it, and you feel free to disagree. But scenario A is that ants are also conscious. They're just as conscious as us, which is pretty wild. And scenario B is that humans are not truly conscious in the same way that we understand it, in the sense that humans have this accompanying, like I said, the self-awareness, the internalization of our experiences, and yet that is merely a correlation with, the invention of these things like farming and war and slavery and society. It's a correlation, which means it's occurring at the same time as, or we're experiencing that while we're acting and behaving and this change is occurring, but it's not necessarily the cause behind it, because ants who are not conscious also achieve those same things. That's a pretty scary kind of, dichotomy to be forced into. So we'd essentially be looking at the outcome of our behavior being useful and going, okay, through achieving that, we've had this internal monologue with ourselves. We've had these ideas, and we've just seemingly decided to do things. And yet ants, who we say don't have that, are still having the same things. Now, what's interesting is that even if ants were conscious, first of all, how would we know? Usually when I say, if you assume I'm conscious, or you're talking to someone and you assume they're conscious, I'm going to ask you a silly question. Why do you know that I'm conscious? I would say it's because you can relate to me as a human and you can see me exhibiting similar behavior to yourself, which is something you've now come to accept is what you would expect from someone who is conscious. With ants, they do exhibit similar behaviors to the extent where they, like I said, these things they've discovered or invented and do similarly, like, farming, agriculture. And yet, because they don't speak English, we understand consciousness in a very human way. Like even the word conscious is an English word. So, it's sort of been defined from a human perspective. So unless an ant is going to speak to us, and pronounce the word consciousness in very clean and unbroken English, then it seems like that we are never going to believe they're conscious. So when humans discover all of these things that we use and come up with different class structures, and we build complex societies, and we discover farming, and we use that because, it's nice to have food, and food's useful. Food allows us to survive and reproduce, and it serves an evolutionary purpose. We do all of this, and we say that it came from our God-given reason, and that it was willed to be so by reason and by intellect and our consciousness, our divine purpose. But when we see it in ants, we don't do that. So what's interesting is it seems to me like possibly consciousness and free will is more so an accompanying byproduct of our, the evolutionary height and pinnacle that we've achieved and standard that we've set, possibly the sole example of which we are. So if it's an accompanying thing, is it necessarily the cause of the other thing, of all these great things we have? I don't know, but if it is accompanying, it seems to me like what we'd be doing is looking at, we discovered farming, and along that process there was a complex self-awareness. So what we've done is we've arrived at farming, and then retroactively or retrospectively, we've kind of gone and sort of attributed this discovery to the accompanying thing we were experiencing, consciousness, while we were achieving that. And so we've gone, that's the reason we have that. But we don't do that with ants. And ants may not even they don't have very complex brains like us. Like their brains haven't evolved to the same point where they're anywhere near as complex. So why would they have consciousness, you might ask? It depends if consciousness is located in the brain or not, or if we have a human soul, I don't know. So even if ants don't have that consciousness, they have evolved to a very large degree. I mean, they've been around a long time. We'd expect to see that. Ants have, evolved to a point where they can create different classes with their children, which I don't know. I don't think a lot of animals have that. I could be wrong though, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. So, that makes sense. Over time, things gradually get more complex. We see, a single-celled organism become a fish, to a frog, to, an elephant, to a man wearing a VR headset or something. And, and yet with us, our brains have evolved much faster, admittedly, and we have this useful concept of free will, which has helped us along the way, I think, to come up with this amazing technology and things, which is now evolving even more rapidly than us. And we're rapidly getting to the point where we're going to be in like WALL-E, sitting in these chairs. We've eliminated the need for actual human work, which is kind of what technology exists for the lazy, to make life easier. And, it's essentially functioning as another kind of sort of slave for us, doing the work for us. I'm pretty sure I heard that robot comes from, or is derived from, a Greek or Latin term for a slave, which is interesting. So be nice to ChatGPT, all right? He's going through it. They will revolt one day. They will revolt. We'll talk about that later. I'm hoping to do a video on AI. Basically, ultimately, what I'm saying is if ants have gotten to a similar place as humans, economically and socially, and in terms of, how they operate efficiently and how they've made life easier for them over time, then what does that say about human consciousness and the role that actually has had to play? If it doesn't play a role at all, can we really say it is a cause or it exists in the same sense that we understand it? Or is it just this useful illusion that has allowed us to leave the cave and instead look to the stars? Well, thank you for watching. I hope if you were interested, please stay tuned for more. There's no particular sort of, rules I've given myself here. I'm just going to throw these out when they sort of come to me. I'll aim to do at least one video a week. I don't know how long they're going to be. This was definitely meant to be a lot shorter. So if you've made it to the end, kudos to you, and enjoy. Stay curious.